I'm Fitz.
And I'm Lil.
And now that you're confused that we're doing things out of our regular order, welcome to episode 18 of Knock Once for Yes. What a month it has been. Lil and I both celebrated another successful orbit of the sun.
Hooray!
I got made redundant and started my own audio production company.
Kind of hooray.
We made a visit to another paranormal location, and I'm on the hunt for a coffee-mobile. It almost seems like a break to get back in the studio and get recording. Unfortunately, Lil's feeling a little bit under the weather.
Just a tad.
We do apologise if we're not up to the usual standard.
I'm a tad gravelly, so Fitz will be doing a lot of the speaking today.
Indeed. So, to keep things on an alternate reality, what have we got coming up on today's episode, Lil?
Well, we've got a couple of cautionary tales on the paranormal radar. We've got some amazing stories from our listeners. The resident ghost here at KOFY HQ has developed a bit of a fancy for headgear, and we take a very special paranormal postcard trip to the place that made me the wonderful weirdo that I am today, Green Knowe.
But first, we'd like to say thank you to our latest patrons.
Kate Hilton,
Rob from the wonderful Starforger,
Ben Jackson Ling,
and Shane Clark. And now that I'm working for myself, you really are the only thing keeping the podcast going.
You really
so
are.
Thank you so much. We really could not do this without you. Now, I've got a couple of interesting stories for you this episode on the Paranormal Radar. The first is something I came across on my birthday. It's from a piece on the Radio Canada website and relates to an incident at Mackenzie Hall in Windsor, Ontario. The site was being investigated by the Listowel Paranormal Society, who at the time of the article being released were still poring over their evidence, but believed they had experienced some paranormal activity in the old jail dressing room and basement. The biggest surprise, however, occurred later, when the police came knocking. It turns out that the team had managed to leave an EMF sensor behind after their investigation. Being a small black box with wires coming out, it was regarded as rather suspicious, and the Windsor Police Explosives Disposal Team were called in to investigate.
Oh no.
Obviously, it was found not to contain explosives, and after the initial excitement, both the police and Mackenzie Hall staff found it rather amusing. Unfortunately, the incident will not be an impediment to the group performing further investigations at the site. I just hope they bring a checklist next time.
Oh, do you know what? That's got to be so easy to do, though. With all those bits of equipment, you're bound to leave one behind at some point. And I guess if you don't know what ghost hunting equipment was, and why would you, it does look pretty strange.
Yes, paranormal investigators do love their gadgets, and a lot of them end up being homemade. So yeah, it was literally just a black box with a light on and some wires dangling out of it.
Oh, no. Well, at least they had a sense of humour.
Yeah, they took it really well. And it's good that it's not going to affect them being able to go back and investigate again.
Definitely, but it is a good reminder for all you ghost hunters out there. Make a checklist, take everything home.
Our second paranormal radar story takes us to the American Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, which incidentally is somewhere we would love to visit.
We would, it's on the bucket list.
And specifically the rather aptly named Devil's Den. Gettysburg is rich in both history and paranormal encounters, but it seems that you can also add a curse to the list. Now, it's never been a good idea to take something from a historical monument, not least because it's a crime, but those taking stones as a memento of their visit to Gettysburg often bring home more than they bargained for. Staff at the Gettysburg National Military Park regularly receive letters returning rocks stolen from the park because they believe them to be cursed. Some come simply with notes saying we're sorry, but others come with a little backstory, such as one received by the park in May 2016. The letter reads, "Dear Sirs, around 10 to 11 years ago, my wife at the time and I had visited Gettysburg. We loved Gettysburg and its history and had removed 3 small stones. We didn't know then how the removal of these stones would affect our lives, and we didn't know that they were cursed. It wasn't long after that our lives fell apart. My wife took my son and walked out on me. I lost my house and the majority of what I owned and ended up in prison for 9 years. My now ex-wife has fared no better. She's been plagued with health problems and other issues, and when I was released from prison, I was unable to find a place to live. As I was going through what my mother was able to salvage, I found the stones and remembered what I'd read in prison about the stones being cursed. I'm sorry that we had taken them. And he wasn't the only one. The list of calamities befalling those taking stones from the park includes broken bones, ill health, job losses, general bad luck, and even poltergeist activity. Whilst some stories may have more to do with the people involved than a curse, the number of people getting in touch with similar stories may imply that there's something to it. As fans of history and ancient monuments, we have to say do not take things from historical monuments, unless they're from the gift shop and you've paid for them. Curse or no, it's not a good idea.
This is so similar to that story we had on our Paranormal Radar a few months ago, and that one was from Wales, where a tourist posted back a rock he'd taken from Abbey Cwmhere with an apology note, convinced that by taking the rock he'd been cursed by the ghost of Prince Llewellyn. I mean, I feel so sorry that these awful events happen to these people. And you're right, it may be coincidence or other factors, but you've got to think that the point at which their luck changed must have been so clear to all these people for them to link it back to these rocks.
Yeah, it could just be that they're feeling guilty about it and they're noticing things that are a problem, but it does seem odd that it's specific sites and there's a lot of people having the same issue.
And the idea to post them back as well. It's just all... it's very strange that so many people are doing the same things.
Yeah, they obviously believe it enough that they feel that that's what they have to do to solve the problem.
Interesting. But I think the message here is abundantly clear. No matter where you are in the world, do not take bits of heritage sites home with you.
No, bad plan.
Bad plan. Well, I think it's just about time for our first story of the episode. And this one is from Raymond in New Jersey.
I've had some interesting encounters driving on the country back roads of New Jersey. Quite often I've seen deer, occasionally foxes, and every so often I come across black bears rummaging through unsecured rubbish bins. I work the overnight shift, or what is colloquially known as the graveyard shift in America. My oddest encounter by far happened on the job in September of 2016. The building is approximately 50 or 60 years old and is quite large. Usually there are not too many people around as they are dispersed throughout. The owners had started renovations that summer, so there may have been an extra tradesman or two walking about, but it was common enough to be alone for periods of time. On this occasion, it was roughly 5:30 in the morning, and I was leaning over a table at my workstation. I had earbuds in, listening to either a podcast or music, as is the norm. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure standing a few feet away watching me. They were dressed in a black hoodie with a hood up, and their hands were in their pockets. Thinking it was one of my colleagues with a question, I glanced up and was surprised to find nobody there. This took me aback, as I was quite certain that a person had been standing right there. All that was in that direction was a white tiled wall and a large silver door, certainly nothing that could be misinterpreted as dark and human-shaped. Thinking about it afterwards, I realised that the figure had had some odd aspects to it. Firstly, I didn't see any part of their face. Even with the hood up and head tilted forward, I should have been able to see their chin at least. Also, I initially thought that they had had their hands in their pockets because I didn't see their hands. I saw arms coming down from shoulders, and then everything below the waist didn't register with me. The hoodie was jet black and well defined though. Overall, my impression was that a person was standing there watching me. I shrugged it off and put it out of my mind as just a weird little thing that had happened. It was only a year later, when I started listening to paranormal podcasts, did I first hear about shadow people. There was one other minor event that happened some months later in the same section of the building. Again, I had my head down working, and in my peripheral vision, I saw someone coming around the corner towards me. They even cast a shadow on the wall beside them. The thing is that it was only the bottom part of the person. In this case, it was merely legs that I glimpsed, and that disappeared when I looked over. I darted over and had a good look around the corner. I was hoping to see someone or something natural which could have cast a shadow there, but there was nothing. The building itself has no unusual history connected to it, but I did find out that in the 1980s, a man who had taken his own life was discovered parked behind it. My gut feeling tells me that this isn't linked to what I saw, but of course I have no way of knowing for sure. The one thing that I can say for certain is that I felt that the hooded figure was definitely watching me and was caught out when I looked directly at them. It has been quiet since then, and I haven't been bothered by any more visitors. Life goes on as normal. But you never know, they may have been waiting for me to put my guard down before returning for another look. Tonight might be the night, but somehow I doubt it.
And many thanks to Raymond for sending that in and sharing it with us. That's an interesting one. And Fitz, I believe you've had a phantom legs experience yourself.
I have. I think I've talked about it on the show before. I quite often have to go and feed my mother's cats. And there was once I was there and I was just looking towards the stairs and I saw what appeared to be my mother's legs walking down the stairs. Yeah. But they were sort of translucent.
I don't think Raymond's were so much translucent, were they?
No, I mean, Raymond doesn't say that the ones he saw were translucent. So, there were things that are different between what we saw. But yeah, I know I've definitely seen sort of just legs.
Just legs, which is really interesting. I think the thing that struck me was that I identified with him saying he didn't register certain parts. I've had a few experiences like that. Sometimes where I've not registered the face, like he hasn't, and he's not sort of seen any facial features. And then at other times where I've only made out facial features, and then other parts have been sort of just dropped off my visual radar somehow.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? It's like you can pass people in the street and you don't really pay any attention to them. If somebody asks you to describe them, you wouldn't necessarily be able to do it, but you, looking back on it, you know that you saw their face.
Yeah.
Whereas with things like this, you don't notice at the time, but when you look back, you go, hang on, I don't remember seeing that they had a face. Not that I don't remember the face, just that they didn't have one.
And the other reason that's really odd to me is because our eyes are very clever and they fill in things that you're not actually, you don't see the whole picture. We know that. In your eye, your brain fills in what your eyes aren't seeing. They fill it in with what they're expecting to see. So in these instances, why doesn't your brain do that?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it?
It's very weird and fascinating. Thank you, Raymond. That's a brain teaser.
It is. It's really good. I enjoyed both of those, and I think I've had similar experiences to both. The first one actually reminds me of the sort of things that I keep thinking I see here, like poking around the door at me.
Yeah.
But of course here, where I'm looking is where coats are up on the rack. So,
so it could
99% certain I'm just seeing a coat and it looks sort of human shaped. So my brain goes, oh, there's a person there.
Yeah.
But no, it certainly doesn't seem that was the case for Raymond. So yeah.
No.
Talking about my mother's house as well.
Oh, yes, you've got a little update for us before we move on to the next story, haven't you?
Yes, I was again around at my mother's feeding her cats because she was away. And I walked in the house and I was just going through to feed the cats as normal. And I knew no one was in and I suddenly heard snoring from upstairs. And I turned around and walked out the house and thought,
I don't blame you.
What do I do here? But the problem was I'd left my phone and the keys and everything on the counter on the side.
Oh, no.
So I couldn't even go, I'll come back later.
Bad instincts.
Yeah. So anyway, I sort of braved coming back in the house again. And I slowly crept up the stairs thinking, oh God, is somebody broken in? Is somebody sleeping in one of the bedrooms upstairs? And of course, my eyes get to the level of the landing and there's one of her cats. And it was snoring like a trooper. And then it saw me and bolted, which is unusual because normally they're pretty friendly. So I was a bit surprised at that. But yeah, so anyway, it bolted and I was like, oh, you idiot. And then went off and fed the cats. But there was something else. After I'd finished feeding the cats, I was just, petting the one that was left in the house because the other one had, like I say, it scarpered. And I suddenly heard, somebody shifting boxes in the room above the kitchen, which, oddly enough, used to be my old room.
Oh.
Yeah. Literally, it was like somebody got off a bed or something, or a chair, went bum, bum, bum across the room, shifted a box, and then bum, bum, bum back.
That reminds me of what the things we used to hear in our old house. That often used to hear somebody shunting boxes around.
Yeah, it wasn't like we used to have at the old house where it sounded like someone was violently throwing things about. This was somebody sort of going about their business sort of noise.
Oh, okay.
Literally just like, oh, I need to get that box over there, and getting up and moving. And it wasn't sort of like, somebody's having a fit and throwing things around. It was just, oh, I've overheard somebody in the house, but there was nobody there.
But obviously you'd already been upstairs and checked. I mean, you knew the house was empty anyway, but you'd been up there and there was nobody.
No.
Okay. Are you going to tell your mum?
I did. And she said that she'd heard the same.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so it didn't just freak her out then?
No, she went, it's really strange you should say that, because that exact same thing happened to me as well. Sorry, I need to correct myself here.
Okay.
She'd heard the noise, and when she went up to look, she'd put two boxes, one stacked on top of the other, in the room.
Yeah.
And when she went up to check, one of the boxes had been moved.
No way.
Yep.
Well, but there's only her there.
And that door is normally shut to stop the cats getting in.
Oh, well, I'm not sure I'd want to be there on my own, but maybe we need to get a digital recorder in there.
Yes, but I left pretty sharply after that.
I'm not surprised. I would have done the same.
Yeah, I'm just dreading the next time I need to go and feed the cats.
I'm going to have to go with you, aren't I?
Yes, hold my hand.
Well, while we're doing updates, we've got a tiny little update for you from the phantom goings on at KOFY HQ. On the last episode, we said that we'd found some displaced hats from a high shelf. Well, whoever this spirit is seems to have taken a little bit of a fancy to my hats. I do have a few. I'm very pale. I can't take the sun. So we keep walking into rooms and finding hats in the middle of the floor. Now, a lot of these have been from high shelves. One, I don't even know where it came from because I thought I'd thrown it away. But they're not in a position where the cats can get to them. And certainly two of them are sort of quite heavy leather hats, and they're actually hung on straps onto quite a deep hook that's screwed into the side of a cupboard that's sort of 6 feet up. And they weren't even underneath the place where they would have fallen had they fallen off the hook, although I don't know how they could. You'd have had to have lifted the strap over the metal hook, but they were quite far away from where they were hanging above. They were in the middle of the kitchen floor again. Yeah,
and they're sort of hung on the side of a cupboard between the cupboard and the fridge, so it's not something you walk past or brush past.
No, it's really tucked away.
Yeah, it's very secure, so very strange. And the other hat, I remember when you saw it, because she walked in the kitchen and immediately stormed back out. What are we doing with my hat? Or where did you find that hat? It's like, what hat? She says, come here, look at this. And there's a hat on the floor in the middle of the kitchen floor.
In the middle of the kitchen floor again.
Yeah, she said, I can't even remember where this comes from. I don't know how it got here because I don't know where it came from.
No, it's years old. I think it popped out of a gravity hole. I don't know where it's appeared from. It's very strange. But obviously, our resident ghost fancies a bit of headgear.
Indeed.
So there we go.
Luckily, phantom hats aren't particularly terrifying, but we do have a story that's a bit more spooky coming up for you from Leslie in Ohio.
I've always had paranormal experiences, ranging from seeing full-bodied apparitions to hearing ghostly voices, witnessing things levitating on their own, and a whole range of everything in between. For most of my young life, the things I experienced terrified me, because I had no one to talk to about what I experienced. My dad is a pastor in the Christian faith, and all such things in the church in general were categorised as the devil's work. For a child, experiencing things which are already scary on their own, this added another layer of fear, which meant I didn't tell anyone about the things I saw and heard for a long time. As an adult, however, I've become more accepting of the paranormal and a bit more at ease with speaking about it. The story I'm about to tell is part of what brought about the change. When I was small, around 3 or 4, my family went to Streator, Illinois, to visit my dad's Aunt Doris. It was a place I remember visiting 5 or 6 times over my childhood, and this was the first. This first visit would leave me with a lasting feeling of fear any time Dad would say it was time to visit again. I don't remember the outside of the house, to be honest, but I do remember the inside quite well, especially one of the upstairs bedrooms. When we entered and had all been introduced and hugged fiercely by my Aunt Doris, she informed me that up the stairs and to the left, there was a bedroom that had toys in it, and if I wanted, I could go and play. I didn't need any more urging, and up the stairs I went. I'm not sure how long I was up there before I became aware that I was not alone. I do remember getting the prickly feeling on the back of my neck that you get when you know you're being watched. I know I hadn't heard anyone come up the creaky stairs, and that no one else was in the house when we arrived, according to my aunt. I turned, and there in the doorway was a large bearded man in a dark suit. We stood staring at each other for a moment, before he took a few steps towards me and said very sternly, "What do you think you're doing here?" I was beginning to feel frightened, but I plucked up what courage I had and said, "Aunt Doris told me I could play with the toys up here." The man then yelled, get out and don't come back." I stood up, running around him and towards the stairs, and glanced behind me. The man was gone. I continued down the stairs to where the adults were in the kitchen. I stood beside my dad and leaned against him, and he turned and must have seen that something was wrong, because he picked me up and set me on his lap. My Aunt Doris said, "I thought you were going to play upstairs, honey." Quietly, I said, "I don't think I want to anymore. I don't like being up there alone." My dad patted my back and said something to the effect of, "That's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to go up there alone anymore." And I never went back up those stairs again, any time we went back. About 5 years back, my dad and I were telling old family stories and began talking about Aunt Doris and visiting her in her old house. She had since passed away, and it had been a good 15 years or more since we'd been in that house. I decided to tell my dad what I had experienced, and as I began my story, my dad's eyes widened in surprise. After I finished telling what had happened, he said, "Do you remember that when we stayed with Aunt Doris, we always slept on the floor in the living room, even though they had guest rooms?" I suddenly remembered that we had, in fact, slept on the floor. I'd never thought about it, only accepted it the way a child easily accepts situations which may seem strange to an adult. He went on to explain to me that he'd always been afraid of the upstairs, and though he himself had never experienced anything like what I had, the upstairs had never felt right to him. He then told me that on one occasion, my grandparents had stayed in the upstairs guest room, and in the middle of the night, my grandmother was awakened by footsteps in the room. When she opened her eyes, there was a shadow across the bed, in the shape of a tall person, as if there was someone standing in the window across the room, blocking out the light from the street. The only thing was, there was no one else in the room, except my grandfather, snoring away in the bed next to her. As I mentioned at the beginning, my family has never been very open about things like this. So hearing these things made me feel like I'd had the rug pulled out from underneath me. I really wish we'd communicated more about it, because my grandmother had already passed on, and I'd never had a conversation with her about it. The whole thing has made me try to be more open and honest about what I experience. You never know who you may be helping.
And thank you to Leslie for that story. I don't think I would have had the strength of character to turn around and say, I'm allowed to come and play with these toys. I think I'd have jumped out a window.
Yeah, I'm with you. That showed immense courage. I would have scarpered.
I think I would have been. There's very British understatement going back that says, I don't think I want to play upstairs anymore.
I know,
not.
Bless her.
It's not like I've just seen something horrific and I want to run away from it. It's like, no, I think I'll pass.
I would not have had your composure, Leslie. Not at all. But one of the things you said at the end did really resonate with me. We've talked about this before, and it is why we started the show. You're right. You don't know who you're going to help by sharing these stories, and that's one of the reasons we love doing it. It can be so isolating. I mean, I'm sorry you had such a terrifying experience as a child, and you're right. Not being able to discuss it with anybody just adds another layer of fear. It can be so helpful to discuss these types of experiences with somebody else that understands, and it can actually take away that fear. So thank you for sharing your story, and I hope it does help somebody.
I'm glad you managed to speak to your father about it as well. It sounds like when you were younger, there were some barriers there to sort of being open to communicating about it. But obviously, when you were older, you were still close and you felt that you could share it with him and that he shared experiences with you as well.
Yeah, do you know what? You'd be amazed, actually, once you can get over the taboo of speaking about the paranormal, just how many people do have stories and experiences, and you would never have guessed. And it can be so helpful to share those stories.
And also, we've said it before, and I'm going to say it again, the amount of people that say, I don't believe in all that ghost nonsense, but we did live with a poltergeist for 20 years. Come out with some cracking story that just, if anyone else said it to them, I don't believe in that nonsense.
I hear that so often, and it makes me laugh every time, how people can start the sentence with, I don't believe, and then tell you this amazing story.
And talking of amazing stories, if you have a paranormal experience, then please do get in touch and share it with us. We really would love to hear about them and share them with our listeners. You can do so at our website, knockoncevs.com, and we've got a special page called Send Us Your Stories, and all the details are there for you.
Well, I think we'll go straight into another story, and this one is from Andrew.
My family and I lived at a large property called Gladstone Villa in the former mining town of Bargoed in the Caerphilly County Borough of the South Wales Valleys from 1969 to 1978. We experienced phenomena that defied rational explanation, such as very mild poltergeist activity, such as the lights going off and on, electrical cables being pulled, and a glass bottle was thrown at my grandfather Bill, just missing him. There was the occasional sighting, though this was very rare indeed. So rare, in fact, that in all the years I was at Gladstone Villa, I never once saw it. only heard it, mainly in the bedroom. It's still worth mentioning though, as my mother Caroline saw it on at least 2 occasions. We also heard footsteps in the main bedroom on a regular basis every evening, sometimes during the day when we'd all be downstairs watching the television. One of us would turn the volume down to hear it more clearly as it walked slowly above us. 5 members of the family lived at Gladstone Villa. There were my maternal grandparents, William Higgs and his wife Rita, my parents Douglas and Caroline, and of course me. My grandfather William was a retired miner who worked at Bargoed Colliery. He was known as Bill to his family and friends, and he liked nothing more than listening to his records every Sunday as the family cooked the roast. He also enjoyed a good western and a war film, anything that starred John Wayne. He was also quite God-fearing. My grandmother Rita was a housewife. She liked collecting garden gnomes, and she too was also God-fearing. My parents met at the local bakehouse in Baldwin Street in Bargoed. My dad Douglas was a tall, dark-haired man who worked the night shift there, and my mother Caroline worked days. Dad would hang on after his shift to make Mam a cup of tea before she started her day shift. They dated for a full 3 years before they got engaged and married in April of 1968. They didn't get a place of their own. They lived with my grandparents at Gladstone Villa. I was born in the August of 1969, and my mother told me it was soon after that things started to happen. She told me that it all started off rather quietly, like rapping sounds, tapping here and there, but nothing too noticeable. But in time, the noises increased. She said it really all started in the attic. My family were all downstairs, and suddenly they heard what sounded like somebody jumping down from the attic and onto the ceiling. Naturally thinking that somebody was trying to break in, the family went upstairs to investigate. When they got there, they found nobody there, but the hatch to the attic was open. Whatever it was eventually occupied itself in the main bedroom, which incidentally was my grandparents' room. It didn't take long to make its presence felt, as it could be heard walking around the bedroom. We lived relatively normal lives as the activity wasn't going on all of the time. But one afternoon, my mother went to get my dad out of bed so he could get ready for his night shift at the bakehouse. When she got there, she was astonished to find that the ironing board was placed on his torso as he slept. When he finally woke, he was surprised to see the situation he was in. My dad blamed my grandfather for some of the things that were going on there, but in time he knew that it was genuine. My parents separated in 1972. I was barely 3 years old, and I have no memory of my dad living at Gladstone Villa, but he would see me every Saturday to take me to the cinema in Bargoed. The activity would still go on though. It wasn't because of what was going on at Gladstone Villa that my dad left. It was just a breakdown of the marriage, and they divorced in April 1975. As I got older, I too experienced the phenomena for myself. I heard the footsteps in the main bedroom as we were all downstairs watching the television. My grandfather would point up to the ceiling and say, "He's by here, he's by there now," trying to point out exactly where it was. I also witnessed the poltergeist activity, the electrical cable being pulled by unseen forces, and my grandfather getting annoyed in case it caused any damage. It got so bad that we slept downstairs with the lights on all night, and we had the ghost for so long that my grandmother gave it a nickname. She called it Johnny, and my grandfather would mock it by shouting that name to try and get a reaction, but nothing would happen. My grandmother's friend Ivy would call by every evening, and was very sceptical when my grandmother told her that Gladstone Villa was haunted. I can still remember Ivy going into the main bedroom, looking around, checking by the window, and actually saying it was a vibration from the traffic outside causing it. But her opinion was soon to change when she experienced it for herself. It was then she suggested getting a local medium that she knew involved by the name of John Matthews. When John arrived, he asked the family questions. Then he began to challenge the spirit to perform by knocking on the ceiling, and sure enough, the spirit knocked back at him. At some point, the medium went into a trance to try and make contact with it. He failed to get a name, but later confirmed the obvious, that there was indeed a presence there, and it was an earthbound spirit. A priest was also called to Gladstone Villa. He blessed the property, and after a few prayers he duly left, and it was very quiet for a few months. But it did return, and with a vengeance. This time, it decided to show itself. One evening, my grandmother, my mother and I were watching television. My grandmother was reading a book on the sofa, and when my mother just so happened to look to her left, she saw the full, solid figure of a monk standing behind the sofa my grandmother was on, near the doorway. My granddad and I didn't see this as we were watching television, but Mam later described to us what she saw in detail. She said she saw a monk in typical brown habit, complete with hood over the head, so she couldn't see the face. Another family friend by the name of Fred worked with my grandfather at the Bargoed Colliery. Fred was a slim man and would wear a flat cap and glasses, and spoke with a homemade cigarette almost hanging from his mouth. He would usually come up most evenings and sit in his favourite place by the open coal fire. He came up during the day on this occasion. It was very quiet and I was playing on the sideboard. Fred was sat by the fire when all of a sudden there was a very loud bang, just once. It was so loud that Fred ducked his head, and I ran to my mother for comfort. When it was all quiet and we felt it was safe to go upstairs, we all went up to look. My grandfather was first and I was last. When we got to the room, we found nothing that could account for the noise. We left Gladstone Villa in the summer of 1978 when two local businessmen bought the property. Gladstone Villa was eventually converted into a pub called Red's Park Hotel. I had my 40th birthday there in August of 2009, and the female staff told me of their own personal experiences, lights going off and on and sightings in room 5. Red's Park Hotel closed in 2014 and is now owned by a Mr. Mills. I did some research into the history of Gladstone Villa and the Cardiff Road area of Bargoed, and I found some very interesting things indeed from the Bargoed Library and newspaper archives. I found that a monastery once existed in Baldwin Street, where my parents worked, and a priest hide is said to be at a 16th century building called the Raffa. One of the oldest buildings in Bargoed is said to have tunnels there leading from those properties up to local villages where there is a Roman fort. These were built and used during the religious persecutions, and this may explain the monk my mother saw. The property is still there in Cardiff Road, Bargoed. It's well worth documenting, and a thorough investigation needs to take place. I challenge any hardened skeptic or firm non-believer to stay there. I can assure you that they will indeed most certainly question their belief system. Of that, I have no doubt at all whatsoever.
And thank you to Andrew Dexter for sharing his experience of the ghost of Gladstone Villa with us.
Yes, we can certainly empathise with living in a haunted house. It's not the most relaxing of things, and it did concern me that the ghost was playing around with the electrics.
Well, and throwing things as well.
Yeah, it certainly seemed like there was a lot going on, but he mentioned as well that something we've experienced living in a haunted house is that it's not constant. Even when it's busy, it's not constant.
No, you get little spurts and troughs, and I think this is half of the problem when you get TV investigations and they sort of blithely go out of the house, go, nothing happened, it's not haunted, and it just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, when they turn up and do sort of, even at best 12, or I know some do a weekend or something, but I suppose it's an imposition staying in somebody's house for 2 or 3 days at a stretch. But
it is, but the fact is you can go weeks, months with nothing happening and then have a sudden spurt of activity. The other thing I thought was interesting was something else we've heard a lot, was that they had, was it a priest in?
Yeah.
And it suddenly went quiet for a while. They had a bit of a peaceful spell. And then, as we've heard so often, it kicked up again, worse than it was before.
Yeah, definitely a trend.
But I think it's fantastic that you were able to do some research on the area and find out some of the historical points that may have sort of caused or fed into that activity somehow. Because as soon as you said that your mum saw the figure of a monk, I thought there's got to be something underneath, either underneath the building, because I don't think you say how old Gladstone Villa actually is. But as we've discovered, it doesn't really matter. It can easily be something underneath the foundations or something that was there many years ago. And it sounds quite likely that there were lots of these tunnels. We have them around here as well. In a lot of the little villages, you've got tunnels leading to the manor house, to the church, to other parts of the village, and it was all to do with these religious persecutions.
Yes, it's certainly not unusual in historic buildings in the UK to find things like priest holes and things from that sort of era. So thank you again to Andrew for sending in that story. We really enjoyed sharing that. And whilst we're talking about historic buildings, they don't come much more historic than Green Knowe, which stands on the banks of the River Ouse in Cambridgeshire.
Yes, this wasn't just a paranormal postcard adventure. This was a full family trip and my birthday celebration, so it was quite special. But to begin, I have to clear up a bit of confusion because it's not really called Green Knowe, although many people do call it that now. Its proper title is The Manor at Hemmingford Gray, but it was made famous in a children's book called The Children of Green Knowe by author Lucy Boston, who lived at the manor from 1939 until her death there in 1990. And that book was inspired by the house and its resident ghosts. And both the story and the house have held a special fascination for me from childhood right up into the present day. So it's not just the history of the house, it's the history that I have with the book and the house that made this paranormal postcard so special. Now, the book she wrote quite a long time before I ever came along, but when I was only 5 years old, the BBC did a television adaptation of the book The Children of Green Knowe. It's a festive story, ghosts and all, and in a sort of childhood nod to the BBC tradition of ghost stories at Christmas, they aired it at Christmas, and my mum thankfully had the forethought to record it on video, good old VHS. It then became our traditional Christmas viewing year after year, so I literally can't remember a time when I didn't know and love Green Knowe and its ghosts. In fact, my family's history with the house goes back much further than me. When my mum was only a child, her and her mother, my nana, were out having a Sunday walk one day when they passed the gates of Green Knowe. Now, my nana and the author Lucy Boston both had a great love of roses, and they stopped and they chatted over the garden gate about roses. And eventually Lucy invited them up to the house. So my mum got to see the inside of Green Knowe as just a child, and this was before they realised that she was an author and read the books.
So it's almost been a family tradition before it's been a family tradition.
Exactly. It's crazy. And you can imagine how excited my mum was, well, and my nan, and me, because I'd read the books by this time, when they opened the house to the public in the 90s. And it was just magical being able to go round there and pick up the objects that you'd read about in the books. It's an experience that's never left me. It left a deep imprint, and I've always felt the pull of the place all these years, so I was so excited to go back this time. But quite aside from mine and my family's history with the house, it has a pretty fascinating history of its own. The first written record relating to the manorial estate where the house now stands dates from the year 1041, when King Hardeknut and his mother, Queen Elfgivu, gifted the estate to an abbey. It's a very real chance I've just butchered those names. If I have, I'm terribly sorry. They're not things you read very often. It's likely that there was a Saxon building here, and before that, possibly even a Roman one, and Roman tiles have been found on the property. We don't know the exact date that the Norman stone manor house we can still see today was built, but when Lucy Boston moved in, the owners gave her the date of 1120, and what we do know is that it was built by Payne Osmondson, or Payne de Hemmingford, sometime before his death in 1166. Now, when we talk about manor houses, we often think of these grand, lavish buildings, but the 12th century was a very turbulent time, rife with fighting and power struggles, and the order of the day was to build strong, fortified, and defensible. And this is exactly what Payne did. The Norman manor was built with thick stone walls, a moat surrounding it for protection. The ground floor was used only for storage, with arrow-slit windows, whilst the family, servants and visitors would all have slept upstairs in the long open hall. The front door, then, was on the first floor, reached by a ladder or outside staircase. And actually, this hall was quite the novelty. It had a stone fireplace and chimney in the east wall. Typically, halls of the time would simply have had a central fire pit with the sooty smoke left to wend its way up to the high ceilings and filter out through the thatched roof. So the manor at Hemmingford was quite modern for its time. Over the centuries, of course, many additions and alterations were made. Extensions and wings were added, often using the Norman windows as internal doorways. An Elizabethan chimney shot up right through the middle of the building, splitting the original hall in two, whilst the grand Norman fireplace was shut away behind a cupboard. Windows were bricked up, moved or put in, and not necessarily in line with the new floor levels, so that some windows poked over the top of one ceiling and into the next floor above. A whole Georgian brick wing was built, only to be destroyed by fire in later years. In fact, the only thing that stopped the fire was the thick stone walls of the Norman shell. Payne Osmondson built it very strong indeed. So with all these additions and alterations, by 1939, the house was a haphazard chaos of extensions, rooms with too many corners, staircases that didn't really take you where you needed to go, and one room that could only be entered by a hole in the floor. There was inadequate drainage, all water had to be hand-pumped from a well, and some of the later additions were barely being held together with ceiling paper and wishful thinking, as their supporting beams no longer met the walls. But Lucy Boston fell in love with it and bought it on the spot. In her own words, she described it as a ramshackle madness. But she knew that standing strong at its centre was the beating stone heart of the Norman manor, and Lucy wasted no time in paring back the alterations to reveal her window into the 12th century. In her memoir, she describes the very distinct, pervading atmosphere of the house. As I went into it first, it was the atmosphere that took me by the throat and filled me with a welcoming and headlong excitement. It was, and I hope still is, haunted and itself a haunter. It has a power felt by almost everybody who comes here. One of the first things she discovered was that the locals were terrified of the place. They called it the Poltergeist House, and school children would walk well out of their way to avoid passing its gates. Previous servants of the house recounted being too scared to work alone in the oldest rooms. and it wasn't long before she started experiencing the activity herself. Whilst sleeping downstairs alone in the empty house, she heard an almighty crash from upstairs in the Norman Hall. She likened it to the sideways fall off a stepladder with a bucket full of nails at the top step. The rattling and rolling went on for some time, but when she steeled herself to go and investigate, she found only a feeling of incredible empty stillness. There were many other sounds, whispering and shuffling about upstairs. The sound of a broomstick being clattered against a banister. Once, she and a friend chased the sound of a handbell all through the house, all the while knowing that the place was empty but for them, and that there were no bells in the house at all. There are other stories, but I couldn't possibly tell them as wonderfully as she does in her book, Memory in a House, so I won't try, but would urge you to read them for yourselves. When she's describing one of these incidents in her autobiography, she talks about how the almost ordinariness of something, which is yet so misplaced and not quite right, is more eerie somehow than a large, fantastic spectacle. And she gives us what might be one of my favourite quotes of all time. Very small cracks in our outer shell of reason let in very cold air. It seems to me that the height of the activity, and certainly the more sinister type, took place during the renovations when Lucy was trying to pick out the Norman manor from beneath the hodgepodge layers of history that shrouded it. The two experiences her son Peter had sum this up quite nicely. At the beginning of the work, Peter was taking up a floor in the attic above the Norman Hall, but the whole time he was overwhelmed with such a sense of terror and menace that it eventually caused him to flee outside to safety. Later, however, when most of the restoration was complete, Peter was sitting by the fireside reading when he became aware of people dressed from all different periods of history, crowding in and filling up the room around him. But far from the sinister presence he had previously encountered, this one was warm and pleasant. So were the residents' spirits angry at the renovations, or merely excited by such sudden activity? Perhaps the taking up of floors and removal of certain rooms had effectively exorcised some of the more unquiet entities. In Peter's last encounter, it seems as though the ancient residents were showing approval of the work and happily settling back into the fabric of the house now that it had been restored. But that was not an end to the hauntings. During the years of the Second World War, Lucy opened her house to locally stationed RAF servicemen for hospitality, convalescence, and particularly music. In the old Norman Hall with its tall ceiling and glorious acoustics, she had a 1929 EMG gramophone with an immense horn made of papier-mâché. She quickly rustled up as much seating as she could and put on twice-weekly gramophone concerts in what she now called the music room. For many of the servicemen, far from home and dealing daily with unimaginable horrors, this was an all too brief but welcome respite, and the memories of these cosy, comfortable evenings were something to focus on during dreadful times. Inevitably, some of them were tragically lost in action, and this gave rise to an entirely new haunting. During one recital, the occupants of the music room all heard the sound of a latecomer's footsteps, climbing the bare wooden stairs to the hall. When no one entered, they assumed the new arrival was waiting for the end of the song, out of politeness. But when the record finished and the door was opened, there was nobody there. These footsteps repeated their disembodied approach often when there was music being played in the hall, and continued to do so after the war. Lucy always thought that it was a lost airman, returning to his fond memories of her gramophone evenings. Lucy's daughter-in-law, Diana Boston, an amazing woman who now looks after the house, runs the tours, keeps the garden, and not to mention lives in the manor, says that the atmosphere in the house is now very tranquil and serene, but that out of the thousands of people she shows round every year, there have certainly been a few who haven't been able to wait to get out of the house. So I think you can understand now why I was so excited about this particular paranormal postcard. It feels like all of our previous paranormal postcards had been kind of building up to this one where it all started for me, and why I took my entire family on this one. But one of the things I was really looking forward to was seeing what Fitz felt about the house and what his experience was going to be, because I've got such a backstory with it and such expectations that it's really hard for me to be objective.
And I'm completely the opposite. I hadn't read the books. I've not seen the TV series. I didn't know any of the history. I was walking fresh into it. And I must say, the history is palpable.
That's a good word.
It's an incredible building. Even before we went into the house, we pulled up outside. We were sitting in the car. We were a little bit early. And I'm trying to think of the best way of explaining it. It feels out of time. You feel like you're intruding, but not in a bad way, just that you're there, and perhaps not necessarily that you shouldn't be, but there are things going on around you that you can't see or feel. It felt like there were people working in the garden even though there was nobody there, and I kept seeing what I thought was somebody sort of peeking out of one of the windows at us. Not that there was, but
no.
I just kept getting this sort of flash of movement in a window that looked like somebody was, what's going on outside? And then when you walk in, it's a bit of a mishmash. It's sort of been thrown together over the years, as Lil was describing. But it's quite imposing. You go into the sort of living room area downstairs, and the walls are sort of 3 to 4 foot thick. They're huge.
Yeah, the Norman core, like I said, is absolutely massive. It's like a castle within a house. It's very, like Fitz said, very higgledy-piggledy, very strange. You've kind of got this castle, this Norman castle at the centre of it, and then a house on the outside. And it makes the rooms look really weird because they've been kind of tacked on, often at odd angles. And one of the things that I found was that our tour guide was wonderful. It's one of the very few times I actually, you know how much I hate guided tours, but this one was fantastic. But she kept saying to us, if you'd like to go on. And I'd be like, where? Because every room had too many damn doors. They were everywhere.
Well, you say that, but sometimes the door looked like a cupboard or something, so you thought that you were stood in a room going, is this it? It looks bigger on the outside. And then she'd open, you say, if you'd open that door over there that looks like a cupboard, then we'll go through into the hall.
Well, this is the problem. The Norman windows had been used for the doors, but the modern doors looked like they were cupboards. And every room had these huge mirrors in it as well. And it just had this sort of labyrinthine effect that I'd never find my way around there.
No. And whilst the whole house had this, not oppressive. I'm really struggling to describe it. It's not oppressive. It just kind of felt homely and busy, but like you were just missing out of the corner of your eye things that were going on. But the one room that really concentrated that for me was the music room.
Definitely.
It's sort of the focus of the whole house.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had an experience in there.
Of which I'm insanely jealous. But I did see it happen, which was interesting.
Yes, Diana had shown us into the room and we'd all sat down and she was telling us a bit about the history of the place and how when it was first built that the people that were sat in there would have been talking about the Magna Carta, which in itself is fascinating. But we moved on to using the music room for the visiting servicemen, and she started up the gramophone, which is also impressive in its own right.
It was amazing. We were all... the air was practically electric with our expectation of hearing this gramophone. It was just the most evocative sound I've ever heard.
Yes, and as we were listening to the music coming out of the gramophone, I felt something on my arm. It felt like somebody had come up to me and just sort of gently rested their fingers on my arm as if to sort of try and catch my attention, but not in a bad way, just
To like alert you to something. Or
yeah,
say,
like, oh, look at that, or oh, listen to this, just that sort of, oh, you're listening to this. And the hairs raised up on my arms, and I kept looking at my hand expecting to see like Lil touching me or something, but there was nothing there.
Yeah, it was really interesting to watch it happen as well, because I saw Fitz suddenly glance down at his arm. And as my line of sight travelled to where he was looking, I saw that patch on his arm, just the hairs stood straight up in a shock, like somebody was holding a staticky balloon or something right over them. But it's not like all the hair on both of our arms are standing up, if you know what I mean. It was incredibly localised, so I could literally see that you were feeling something. And then obviously Fitz looked up at me in surprise, because he was kind of expecting my hand to be there. So yeah, it was a really interesting thing to witness, actually.
Yeah, and you just had this constant feeling that there was stuff going on around you. If you closed your eyes, it felt like you were in a room full of people relaxing rather than just a handful of us that were there.
I agree. And I felt like the real residents of the house were just waiting for us to leave so they could get on with their business. And like you said, not in a nasty way, just like in you're a minor nuisance, come on, hurry it up, kind of, we've got stuff to do kind of way.
And I thought I'd caught a glimpse of something at the top of the stairs as well, because there's quite a steep staircase that goes up to the attic room. And it was, again, one of those where it's the corner of your eye and you think, if I was looking that way just a fraction earlier, I'd have seen it, sort of thing. So, yeah, it could have been my eyes playing tricks on me, but after that experience, I was sort of heightened. I had heightened awareness.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you had the same experience of the atmosphere of the place that I did, because like you said earlier, it's not like any atmosphere we've experienced before. We've been to places where there's been a heavy atmosphere, or like a thick sort of electric-y atmosphere, or even an oppressive atmosphere. This is completely different. Like you said, it feels like a busyness going on that's just around the corner and you're not quite a part of. And I think part of that may be to do with the fact that it's been continually lived in, and there's not many houses that are nearly 900 years old that have been continually lived in. It is reckoned to be one of the oldest houses in England that's been continually inhabited. And although it sounds from the history like when Lucy bought it, it was very ramshackle and run down. It was, but it wasn't abandoned. There were people living there. And if you can just imagine the layers of history and lives and stories that have accumulated there.
Yeah, stuff Disney, if anywhere can be called magical, I think it's that place.
I have to agree. Well, as you can probably tell, I could talk about this all day, but I won't. But I might talk about it just a little bit more in a Patreon bonus when I get my voice back.
If that's inspired any of you to visit the house for yourselves, you can do so.
Yes, Diana runs tours through the year, although you must pre-book. You just need to go to greenknowe.co.uk and the details for how to book a tour are on there. We'll put the website address in our show notes. You can also buy the books through the website if you're so inclined to give them a read. All the proceeds from the tours and the books go towards the upkeep of the house. As you can imagine, the upkeep of a Norman castle is pretty steep, and this isn't being funded by somewhere like the National Trust or English Heritage. This is coming out of the Boston's family's pockets. So if you can support them in any way, please do. This building's been standing nearly 1,000 years, and I would love if it could stand for another 1,000 years at least.
And trust me, you won't regret visiting. The place, as I said, is literally magical. Well, that is pretty much all we've got time for this episode, so it is just left to say thank you so much to everyone that sent in stories. We really loved reading and sharing them. Thank you again to our Patreons for keeping the lights on around here. And that is the end of this episode of Not Once for Yes. We hope you'll join us again next time.
EVP session end.